Okay, we're going to look at overhead variances, and just like with material variance and labor variance, they come in two parts. That's going to be the same situation here. We're doing this from the textbook, so the slides you see here are in the textbook. If they get cut off, in some cases they do a little bit, you can go and read it and see it in full in the textbook. I'm just using these pictures as a guide, and we're doing the textbook approach since there are some variety of ways to analyze overhead variances, so we'll use the Wiley approach here, which comes in two parts. This picture hopefully will illustrate it. Part one here, or we'll call it A, is what's called the controllable variance, and we'll explain that in a second. And part two over here is the volume variance. So let's first talk about the controllable variance. The idea there with the controllable is that we are looking at the difference between actual overhead, the actual overhead that we incurred, versus the flexible budget overhead, flexible budget being at the actual volume amount. So the flexible budget and the overhead are looking at actual costs of the actual overhead costs versus the overhead costs in the flexible budget, with no difference in volume. So here the volume is the same in both cases in our analysis, and thus, since the volume is the same, both of them are at the same volume, both numbers are at the same volume. We're only looking at what did management do at the same volume with the overhead cost. Did management come in below or greater than what we would have expected overhead to have been based on the flexible budget? If the management comes in at a lower number, which they do here, that's considered favorable. But remember, favorable may not be good. If management were to have spent $25,000 in actual overhead, the flexible budget called for 24, so that would be considered an unfavorable variance. All right, the B part over here, which is the other second part of the analysis of overhead, is an analysis just comparing what happens to the original budget after we flex the budget based on the change in volume. So this is going to be called the overhead volume variance as opposed to the controllable amount. And basically all we're doing is looking at, well, how much overhead got applied at the actual volume of 450, but the amount that's getting applied was based on the original expected volume. We'll see what this means when we get into it. And then you look at the flexible budget, which is the really the overhead at the true volume amount. And since we're comparing it based on the applied amount, the applied overhead based on the budgeted volume, I'll say budgeted, that came out beautiful. Let's try that. Budgeted volume, applied overhead at the budgeted volume. And what it's doing is comparing that applied amount of overhead to the flexible budget, which is still at the same real actual volume, just like the application of original overhead is at the actual volume, but now it's adjusting the flexible budget, adjust the budget for the real volume. So this is an adjusted flexible budget. Go back to chapter 10 if you need to read about it, but the flexible budget is adjusted for the actual volume. To remind you, what happens is that when we compute the overhead rate, we're computing it at an expected volume amount. In this case, it was at 15,000. And then based on that rate, and we'll see this in a minute, based on the rate, $15,000 for 500 units, $15,000 for 500 units expected, the amount that gets applied each time a unit is produced is based on this original volume amount. If the volume changes, then we really should have applied a different number, because we're always applying into the books and records based on the original overhead rate. So the flexible budget is just saying, well, what should it have been if the volume would have been adjusted? Here, this is adjusted where you take the same 15,000 fixed overhead amount and divide it by 450. So in that case, the amount per unit is greater than it was over here. So the applied per unit at the volume of 450 will actually be a lower number compared to the amount when you have a lower amount of volume. We'll see more about that as we go along. So let's just get the big picture and then go into the detail. Okay, so the detail of the controllable variance is here. They give you a problem, or they give you numbers to see what it's going to actually be. They tell you what the actual overhead is, and then they say, based on the flexible budget, what they had was the following. They had the same $15,000 fixed portion, and they had $20 was the variable amount of overhead times the actual number of units, because we're doing it at the actual number of units, and that flexible budget comes out to the same 24,000 that we've been seeing. And when you compare that to the actual overhead, which was 23, that means that the budgeted number was 24. We came in at 23. That sounds like it's a favorable direction to go in for me, and so they call it $1,000 favorable. It's a variance from the flexible budget in a favorable way. And here's the actual overhead cost broken down by categories, and we're going to see those in a second compared to the flexible budget broken down by category. Again, notice that the facts are it's 15,000 fixed, $20 variable in the flexible budget. But the actuals came out like this. So you can already see some of the favorableness that the fixed overhead cost, which was budgeted at 15, came out lower here. So you can start to see that we're going to be looking at a favorable variance overall. This is what the budgeted fixed overhead costs were, adding up to the 15,000. Here's how we came out with $20 per unit for the variable amount. And what really what happens is that you take 500 units, that's the expected amount, times 20, which will give you, what will it give you? Don't tell me. Well, maybe you should tell me. It gives you $10,000. So 10,000 along with the 15 here in the original budget, it means we're going to apply 25K in total if we have 500 units. If we have less, we'll apply less. If we have more, we'll apply more. That's just the application of overhead based on the original budget. We figure out 25K divided by 500 units gives us a $50 per unit overhead charge, and so that's how we charge the overhead as we go along, because we don't know what the ending result's going to be until we're done. We don't even know for sure what volume we'll have until we're done. Here's the flexible budget now based on 450 units, and how did it get flexed? Well, the 15,000 remains the same. That doesn't change. That's fixed. But now with the variable overhead costs, we have brought it down based on the real $450 actual volume, so that we can see that the total flexible budget should be 24 because the variable amount should be $20 total per unit times 450 units. So it's $20 total per unit, 450. Whereas over here, what we were really winding up going to do is we were prepared with the $50 unit, we were prepared to apply $50 per unit for 500 units, which would cover both the fixed portion here, the A, and the expected variable cost of 10,000 at a 500 unit amount of volume. This schedule here shows you a comparison of the actual overhead to the fixed budget overhead costs, and what you can do, what the textbook goes through, is line by line to see what does it all mean. But notice that the total, after you shrink all the unfavorables and favorables together, comes out to the $1,000 total unfavorable that we saw when we first looked at the difference between actual overhead and the flexible budget. And remember, this is all considered controllable since it's comparing the budget to the actual based on the same amount of volume. So this shows, well, how did management do with rent? Oops, they incurred more rent than we expected. They incurred more salary than we expected, and so on down the line. Even the variable overhead costs, there were some changes, and we're going to look to management as to, did they do good? Did they do bad? What caused the actual expenses to change? All these are expenses are somewhat controllable by management. Okay, now let's go on to the volume variance, but before we do, we'll stop and take a break.